Hello, beautiful people. My name is Emma,
And I'm MC.
and we are your hosts of the G Forces podcast. So, as you can see, we have switched positions. I'm not technically in the same spot that MC was in last time we recorded, but I'm in the same home that she was, and MC's where I was last time. Is this episode and our next episode that will be like this for, but then after that, we will be back to normal, hopefully for a good long time. That's
Well, we
the
might
assumption.
be changing locations,
Oh,
but
we're not just changing locations. You guys probably don't care about this, but MC is now a homeowner. So we are going to have a legit studio in her home where it's
well,
going to be our permanent setup.
it's
So
not like it's just an extra guest room, but yeah.
still,
Um,
it's more of a setup than we currently have. So it's very exciting.
yeah, life has been literally insane. I mean, between all the stuff going on in our own personal lives, but also, buying the house, traveling, doing F1, also having our full 9 to 5 because this is literally just a hobby. Yeah, we've been in the fast lane and it's not slowing down, which
No,
is
not at all.
great. Love going into a triple header. But
So there are a few things that I want to talk about before we get into the actual race. So, some stuff that I want to. Oh, also, though, just because we didn't mention it, the Barcelona Grand Prix was earlier this morning. It was, I'd say, an average race weekend for 2024. No shocks, but no easy wins, I would say.
I mean, yeah, I don't think there's any shocks in the sense of what, an upset or, someone crazy winning. I mean, it's pretty typical, but I do think we say this every single week, but the gaps are getting tighter and tighter to an insane degree that I think the tire deg, the pit stops especially, but also just like the general strategy is making or breaking people winning or even podiuming or podium
Yeah,
being on the pole, like
yeah.
podiuming. Um, so I think it's getting crazy. Like it really is. And I know everyone's saying that right now, but like the race itself was a little sleepy-ish, but we're having more battles. We're having more fights, and I mean, we were seeing this time last year, in my opinion. So,
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of stuff even going on in the middle of the pack that we're just not seeing on F1 TV because they typically will just follow the front runners. And the times that we do see stuff going on in the middle of the pack, it's just because it might be a little bit of a rest period for the front runners. But yeah,
or we see the middle of the pack because someone from the front of the pack pitted and now has to fight in the middle of the pack, and so they'll show us what's happening just because someone from the front of the pack. And I get it. I mean, there's a lot of coverage, which is why it's funny. I don't think I told you this when I was watching with Dad. He was like, "Do the people ever stop talking?" And I was like, he does watch baseball in silence, which is just crazy. Um, but I will say they're constantly talking because there's 20 cars on the grid and there's 20 different things happening. And literally, yeah, I'm sure some people find their pontificating and all that a little annoying, but there's so much strategically happening for every single car that it's like they have to be talking the whole time because we don't get that coverage. So,
there's been a few times where we've watched races where we're not really able to pay attention to what the commentators are saying. And I actually find those races really difficult to remember because I need to listen to the commentators and what they're saying, and I need to know like Ruth's impact right now and her like insight, just adding like this is what the strategist would typically do, or like right now, like between now and the end of the race, this is a strategist race. This isn't a race car driver's race. This is all about strategy, and if they get it right, then it'll be a race car driver race. But right now, it's all about your strategists.
quick moment on Ruth for anyone who is new to the sport who wants to understand from like not a pop culture standpoint, but more really from a strategic standpoint and what goes into the race. Follow her, listen to her when she's speaking because she is diving into the sport in a way that we weren't receiving. I mean, and not for anyone's fault, but we were not receiving her perspective or a strategist engineer's perspective until this point. And I will say, like, the value in my eyes that she's bringing to F1 TV is incredible because she's explaining things in a way that I don't feel like just a Drive to Survive girly. Like I feel like someone who's understanding it, I'm seeing it, I'm like, okay, this is what goes into it. And so like anyone who's new to the sport and you want to learn more, from a strategic standpoint, definitely pay attention to what she's talking about.
Yeah, 100%. So some of the things that I wanted to bring up before we get into the actual race weekend content is so one of the news things that popped up was Alpine signs Flavio Briatore as an advisor. Advisor
I
as in like
forgot.
Helmut Marko is an advisor, Niki Lauda was an advisor, so now Flavio Briatore is an advisor. This
Okay, so okay, before you get into it, I don't know anything about this man. I don't know anything about the controversy. And so when this news
oh, you
announced,
do.
it'll probably like the light bulb will go off. But for those that don't know, we've explained this before, but I'm in Tennessee right now and Emma's in New York. So we haven't watched anything F1 together for 3 weeks. And we live together regardless of this travel time. So like normally it's like we're just back and forth on what's happening in the F1 world. So she texts me and she's like, "Oh my God, I can't believe about Flavio." And I'm like, "I know nothing about who this person is." And she's like, "It's controversial." I'm like, "Tell me during the podcast because I don't know anything about this dude."
So the reason why it's controversial is because Flavio Briatore, to my knowledge, was the team principal of Benetton and when Crashgate happened. And Crashgate involved his drivers, and he apparently was the one to make the call for Crashgate and be like, it should happen. And he was
Okay.
actually banned from F1 for quite some time. The ban has been appealed now, so he is back, obviously.
Love to see that.
But that's why it's problematic because of that situation, and the fact that he was banned and now he's back, and for Alpine to make him an advisor when they've already got some stuff going on, it just feels weird. So the Alpine team principal, Bruno something, he is like, I'm so excited for this. And there's a lot of people that are like, okay, you're excited. This is an interesting choice of words to use. I don't know enough about Flavio, yeah, to have a full opinion on it. All I know is that it's a controversial take that he is
Okay.
coming back to F1.
I mean, for all intents and purposes, Alpine is floundering when it comes to executive personnel. I don't know on like the factory, the sub level, the 500 employees that work, where Alpine's based. But it just seems like they are, and maybe they're bringing him in to spice it up further, who knows? But it seems like I don't want to say scraping the bottom of the barrel because I think that that's quite a rough perspective on these people's careers, but it just seems like they have had a massive turnaround and now they're kind of stuck with these interesting characters, so to say.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. I don't think I know enough about it to really
Yeah,
say if it's a good or bad choice, but I'm interested to see how it goes next year with this choice having been made. I'm also surprised with their investors that this choice was made. Given his history in the sport, I'm shocked that the Hollywood investors were like chill with it. But who knows? Who knows? Not me.
maybe maybe the background isn't as bad as the tabloid story. I don't know.
I think the
We shall see.
background is worse than the tabloid story, to be honest. But I will say Alpine had a pretty decent weekend, so I'm glad for
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
The other things I just wanted to bring up before we get into the actual like race weekend is there were several teams that were bringing updates for this weekend. That's because the Spanish track is, um, it was the test track for many years, and it's a good track to be able to see how you're going to, I guess, go up against other teams throughout the rest of the European calendar. It has a lot of high speed areas, but then some low speed areas. So it gets a little bit of everything. So that's why it's a good spot for people to bring upgrades. So Ferrari brought an upgrade, Red Bull brought upgrades, Visa Cash App. They basically rebuilt their car, which
Yeah.
is good and bad at the same time. Who knows? And Aston Martin brought upgrades. And something that I actually found out this weekend is the only need to announce publicly visible changes to the car. So if it's not visible, I think the FIA has to know and like F1 has to know, but the other teams don't have to know. And it does not have to be included in the upgrades like report that we get at the beginning of every race weekend.
Huh. So that's only visual aspects of the car, like what you can see.
Yeah.
That's surprising.
But
But
most of it you
again,
can see though. Like you can see
well,
when
yeah,
they
I
make a
guess
change
you're
to a
right.
side pod. You can see when they make a
True.
change to a front wing. Um,
True. I guess it's
so
more because it's so secretive, the inside workings and the wirings and whatnot, that I mean, it makes sense.
yeah. Well, that's everything from me for the beginning. Do you want to get into free practice?
Yeah, let's get into the race
Oh my
info
gosh.
before free practice, as Emma keeps forgetting, I think every episode.
It's not in my notes, it's in your notes. So that's why like I jump from like news from the weekend immediately to free practice on my notes. So I never think about track info. So we're gonna go into track info. Mary Catherine, where are we?
All right, so obviously for the Spanish GP, we are in Spain, Barcelona to be exact. If you want to hear Emma's real thoughts and feelings about Barcelona, check out our last episode. Emma goes into her thoughts. I am neutral, so
You've never
just
been.
exactly, and I'm gonna stay neutral. But yeah, so let's get into the track and race weekend info. So the official race name, I feel like this is kind of when we get to like the really long names because of the sponsors. So it's the Formula One Aramco Gran Premio de España 2024. And yes, for all my family listening, I butcher the accent. I'm sorry. I try, but when you're learning Spanish in the US public system, you can get back to me. So the circuit name for this is the Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya. The
Hold
first
on.
F1.
You mean Barcelona.
Oh my God. All right. The first F1 Grand Prix was held in 1991, and the circuit length is 4.657 kilometers or 2.89 miles. The drivers completed 66 laps, and the distance for that circuit length and those amount of laps is 307.236 kilometers or 190.9 miles. I feel like we're normally like 190, 191. There were 14 turns on this racetrack, and the fastest lap record, which is still in place, was placed by Max Verstappen in a Red Bull last year in 2023. He did a lap in a minute and 16.330 seconds. There are two DRS zones at this track. DRS detection zone 1 is between turns 8 and 9. Activation begins after turn 9. And then detection zone 2 begins after turn 14 with activation, where we typically see it in that start finish straight. So this is deemed like one of the more traditional tracks. It is the first leg of a European triple header. So I think this kind of like sparks that excitement because so many of these guys, I mean, there's so much history. I think 1991, like Senna was, I mean, you went over it, right? It was 91 that you went over last week, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like so much history here. I think too, like Emma said prior, I mean, there's literally photos of them doing preseason testing, and one year it snowed. Um, so obviously very different vibes than where they do it now. This time around, very different environmentally. Um, but I definitely thought watching it, I don't know if you agreed, this was the first track, and it could have just been the angles, but it looked like toy cars. It was the first track that, like, watching it, especially in the race this morning, some of the helicopter shots. I don't know if it was because of the spacing of everyone, but it really, like, it was. It was really, I'm kind of bummed that I think it's what, 2026 it's moving to Madrid. Um, but yeah, I thought it was a really fun track.
I think the track that reminds me most of toy cars is Coda for some reason. I think because Coda takes inspiration from so many of the European tracks and combines
Yeah.
them into one track. The overhead views of it look very much like a toy car, but I can see what you're saying. I felt like this was the first track that we've been to this season that feels. I mean, we went to. Oh my God, we already went to Japan. Sorry,
Yeah.
there's some tracks that we've been to that I'm like, I forgot that we've even been there already. Because I was gonna say this is the first track that feels like a classic F1 track, but Suzuka is a classic F1 track, if not one of the most classic motorsport tracks. Um, but Suzuka has its own individual things that are very different from other
So
tracks.
it, Italy, Emma.
I forgot we also went to. This is
Yeah.
we are only on the this was the ninth race, and I am already forgetting like half of the races that we've been to this
Imagine
season.
how the actual like F1 employees feel.
Yeah, but
Like,
that is their whole world. We have like 20 other things going on at once in our life at all times where their life and world revolves around F1 and going to these new places.
yeah, but I'm sure in their own right, time becomes very weird. But anyways,
Do you have any more on the track?
no, that was it. Yeah, that's pretty much the roundup.
All right, now we're going to get into practice. Okay, so for both practice oh my gosh, both, I mean all three practices, there wasn't a ton going on to be honest. So in FP1, the main things that I have written down is that we had Ollie Behrman in Hulkenberg's seat. Um, didn't really do anything other than do your typical tests. I think that this is just an example of how I feel like in past seasons, usually we see multiple people do these FP1 sessions for rookie sessions, but I feel like Haas is just having Ollie Behrman do them almost as let's get you as
Well,
much F1 practice as possible.
well, and I've talked about this before, and I think you were like, really? Um, this is a second of six scheduled
Yeah.
practice sessions. So they are putting him in the car. I feel like it's solidifying his seat in 2025. Like I do feel like this is just kind of that confirm. I know that there were conversations from IO in regards to you know, who they're talking to. But yeah, I feel like the three practice sessions we witnessed for this weekend really did just feel like preseason testing, or it felt like the first season because so many people, I think it was close to like, I mean, you listed it off, but I think it was like something like seven of the teams brought upgrades. So no, it was less. It was only
It was,
five.
well, so only four brought visible upgrades, but then others internally probably brought stuff. They just didn't have to report that.
Okay. Yeah, because I definitely feel like at the end of the day, I feel like it just everyone was playing it safe. Everyone was figuring out their cars. Like it did feel like, and especially after, I mean, freaking Montreal, like they're all trying to get their bearings again. But yeah, Ollie Behrman being in Hulkenberg's seat, I feel like it's kind of like the when they put Jack Doohan in the Alpine car. It's kind of like, is this? is this a job? Like, is this literally F1's version of like second round job interview? Like, what are we witnessing? Or is this like, hey, practice in case you get the job? Like, yeah.
Well, I think it was Will Buxton said that he asked Jack Doohan this weekend, or it might have been in Canada, but I think it was this weekend. He saw him in the paddock early in the weekend and walked up to him and was like, "So, well, are you gonna be here next year? Like, are you gonna have that seat next year?" And Jack was like, "No comment."
Apparently, he had a similar interaction with Ollie Behrman, and Ollie Behrman, like, apparently was like all smiles. It was trying to hide it, but
Yeah.
obviously, we'll see. I'm just, in terms of 2025 season, before we get further into FP1, I'm like, the science news needs to be released because that's what's holding everything up. So, anyways, um, the only thing I had for at least FP1 that was also talked about besides Ollie Behrman was Max Verstappen has taken a new took a new power unit for the Spanish Grand Prix weekend. For those that are new, they're only limited to a certain amount of power units. Obviously, if three, as Emma just signaled for those that are listening, three power units. Once they exceed the maximum amount of three, obviously they're allowed to replace them. Otherwise, the car, they're out. But the thing is that once they replace, once they move to the fourth power unit, they get penalties. So the big conversation is, like Emma said, it's round nine. A lot of people, I think like Alex Albon hit his power unit limit by like round four or five. So like there are people who have hit that limit. This isn't like breaking news. It's just because of the general curiosity of how close it is right now, those penalties might come and bite Red Bull in the ass, but also power units, they're notoriously replaced. Um,
Well, I don't think anyone's actually hit that yet, to be honest. I think people ha are close to it. I think
mm.
Max is the one that's furthest in. He's hit his limit now, so when he has to replace it again, and the fact that it's only round nine and he had it already replaced and he's already gone through three power units is kind of insane, which means at that rate, he's gonna go through another three, four of them probably. Um, and it's not a small penalty that you get. From what I remember, I think it's like a 10 place grid penalty you get pushed back. So for him, last year, a 10 place grid penalty on round 19 didn't mean anything.
Yeah,
Now,
he'd move up.
when Lando is P2 in the Drivers' Championship and is coming behind him every single race now, it matters. It's not an easy race for you. It's not easy. You can't start P10 and just easily walk up the grid like you did last year. It's not as easy as it was before. So I'm interested to see how this plays out for the rest of the season.
Well, I also think about the few times we've seen, and granted, there were issues, but the few times we've seen Max start at P6, I think he started, a few races ago in P6. It took him a while. He was stuck, So I think it's something to keep a close eye on, especially with the current driver standings and the fact that things, like we say every freaking weekend, things are getting closer.
Yeah, the only th other thing that I have for FP1 is that Fernando actually went over a curb and lost part of his, I think it was his rear wing. Obviously, they could replace that. They weren't in Parc Ferme yet, so you can replace parts during practice. So it wasn't that big of a deal, but still, that also probably screwed up a little bit of his floor as well. That's all I have for FP1. I actually don't have any notes on anything that the drivers did during FP2, but I took a note on something Sam Collins talked about during FP2, which was very important for conversations that we've had in the past. So, Sam Collins discussed fossil fuels being banned in 2026 in F1. So the normal fuel that we see them use all the time, it's going to be banned. And so that's how they're going to become, what is it? Their carbon
Net
emission. Yeah,
zero.
net zero. And so a new fuel made of waste, so like food waste, stuff like that, is going to be the one that's introduced. And Audi has been working on this fuel since 2012, and they even almost introduced it to their WEC cars back when they were driving in WEC. And so that's why people were saying it would be surprising if Carlos doesn't go to Audi, Stake, Sauber, whatever it is right now, because their fuel is much more promising than like a Mercedes fuel from like Williams or any other fuel coming from another team. Because do we really think Williams has the research on that fuel that other teams have when they haven't even had the money or the time or the resources to put into their car? I don't know. If Audi's had this time and money and resources to put in since 2012, I would feel much more comfortable with that than a team who has only recently had money to kind of put into their car.
Yeah, I'm curious in terms of what holds more value. The fact that they've had this ability to research this fossil fuel that they've put the time in. I mean, or their car, like what it's like a balancing act at this point. What is going to be, are you willing to sit here and honestly, for all intents and purposes, have a pretty dog shit 2025 season? I mean, that's what their projections are looking. Or are you willing to sit there, take the really rough days of what 2025 is going to be? And regardless where he goes, his two options, they're not going to be, peaches and cream. So, like, are you getting to this point where, like he's picking his poison, I feel like at this point. No offense to either team. It's just, it's not going to be freaking fun like, it's not going to be Ferrari results. So,
Yeah, but either way, I thought it was an interesting comment that Sam Collins made, especially because we've been wondering what the difference is going to be between F1 and Formula E when they go net zero. And so they're still going to be getting fuel, which is something that Formula E doesn't get because they're fully electric. But the fuel is just not going to be a fossil fuel.
my final point on that too, I'm curious how many teams have been working on alternate fuels with the fact that, I mean, it's a pretty small group of people. I'm sure gossip, conversation. I don't know how the 2026 regulations work in terms of like if this is like a general discussion, consent. I don't know. But Williams has constantly talked about how they're looking at 2026, how they're putting the time, that's where they're putting all the effort. So I wouldn't discount Williams altogether. Yes, I'm saying this as a biased Williams fan, but I wouldn't sit here and completely write them off in terms of what 2026 is going to bring because they have brought to the table that they are very focused on the new regulations. So, um, yeah, I'm not discounting them entirely. Will they have the research and, success as Audi? But also, who knows what Audi's going to bring to the table right now? I mean, as Sauber right now, they're not doing great. So,
Yeah. The last thing on this whole fuel thing, just before we jump over to FP3 is so F1 has kind of served as almost like an experimentation ground for just like regular civilian population, like car research
yeah,
almost.
F1 does, World Endurance Championship does. They're basically like guinea pigs for what the like civilian car design teams can use. They're basically using these cars to push motors and car design to the extreme to see what they can relay into our our cars.
Well, and so because of that, with this switch in fuel in 2026, if it is efficient and it doesn't create fossil fuels and it's much better for the environment, I'll be very interested to see how quickly companies pick this up, and actually start using it as a regular fuel for the rest of society. Because I
Here's
think
my
it could
thing
be
though.
really interesting.
Money rules the world. How many of these companies that are sponsors are predominantly oil companies? Where it's kind of that's my thing. And I mean, maybe I'm looking at this as like from the American perspective, but there's a lot of money in fuel and oil.
I'm going to agree with that because,
You
I
start to
mean,
cr- you start to create something that one will be able to utilize, and granted, this is also theoretical, we're talking about they might not successfully create something that they can put into the mass market. But my whole thing is like, if they're successful, I don't know. I'm looking at it from again, like an American perspective, and
No,
like,
I mean,
but
also, I too am an American, so both of our perspectives are going to be from the American point of view. But that's actually a very good point because I mean, one of the biggest sponsors in F1 is Aramco, and they are an oil company. And the reason, and we've been moving a lot of the races into the Middle East, which is typically where all the oil is coming from and going out to the rest of the world. So it's definitely an interesting point to make.
I will
But they've already
say,
promised net zero. So if they go back on that, there is going to be some backlash.
well, and I will say in Aramco's, not like not that they need, my defense, but it does seem like from the social media perspective, there is a lot of like sustainability coming from these companies. So I could be talking out of my ass right now. Like they might be all for it. But it's just interesting. So, anyways, FP3, I really don't have much except that Carlos topped this session, which I feel like kind of tricked Ferrari fans. Um, and then the top five were very tight within 2 or 1/10 of a second of each other. And so I think it's, again, as I've said 4 times in the last 40 minutes, it is so freaking tight.
So the things that I have were the Charles and Lando incident.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. Okay. I just think
uh,
it was like distracted driving. Like, were you texting? Like,
Like it almost looked like Charles like brake checked, like he like passed Lando and then like brake checked him. It was very weird. And then a similar incident happened with Lance and Lewis.
yeah.
And they were both investigated and they were just given like a slap on the wrist and nothing else. And there was actually a quick clip on, I think it was F1 TV, where you can see Max talking to Lando after quali, I think it was.
I
And
saw.
Max was like, "Oh yeah, Charles only just got a reprimand." And Lando was like, "Are you for real?"
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that it was like bad lip reading. And I'm like, maybe that's what they were talking. Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah. Well, that's all that I have for free practice. I think it's time to get into qualifying. Qualifying, in Q1. Um, we see
Well,
look you go. You
oh,
go.
I was just gonna say a quick statistic before we get in. So of the 33 Grand Prix that have happened in Spain, 30 of the Grand Prix have been won by a driver from the front row. So qualifying at this race obviously is not as heavily weighed as qualifying at a place like Monaco, where that really is the race determination. But I do think that there either it is a big contender or if it's a superstition, but it does seem like there was a lot of pressure to gain that front row ability.
I think just in general, this season, people are taking it very seriously because of how close the gaps are. Like, there's a very small margin between P2 and like P7. And so,
Yeah.
if you don't perform at the highest possible level, you are going to end up in P10 when you could have possibly ended up P1 if you performed at your best, but you just performed your best. So, yeah.
But the only thing I really, well, not the only thing, but one thing I wanted to focus on was because of the amount of upgrades, and this is something we talk about all the time, but upgrades does not necessarily always mean good. And Williams and V-Carb really, really showed the struggle of the upgrades that they brought this weekend, since both drivers for both teams were subsequently knocked out in Q1. I think you just this is the perfect example of like try stuff and it doesn't work. Obviously, in Williams' situation, it's been an every weekend thing. But V-Carb really, as Emma said at the beginning of the episode, they really came in with, they were calling it a Spec 3 car, like a brand new, like basically rebuilt car. And then it obviously didn't work for them. So there's probably going to be a huge amount of changes, or they're going to, step back and go back to the original design. But I think Q1 really showcased how negative upgrades can be for teams.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. Williams didn't bring new upgrades necessarily this weekend, but they brought an upgrade, I believe, to Canada, and it was a new floor, which Alex had in his car, and Logan finally had all the
Yeah.
upgrades that Alex had on his car, so they were finally driving in even cars. But yeah, Logan actually it was a partial impeding of Lance. But Lance took it way all of them. Okay, I'm sorry. They're complaining about things is the equivalent of men's soccer players faking an injury. I'm sorry. Sometimes your complaints are so dramatic. And I understand you're driving so fast that if one thing is out of line by like a hair, something bad could happen.
Do
But
you think
it's just too much sometimes.
do you think it's a generational way of driving? Like, or do you think it's the fact that the margin for a place and points is so thin that they're basically like flag everything. Like we're gonna flag everything.
I think it's a mixture of both actually, because I don't think that drivers were doing this in like the 90s. I think like if you complained like this, you were kind of seen like a wimp almost in the 90s from the vibes that I've gotten off of the stuff that we've read about. But at the same time, the gap is so small between first and 10th sometimes that it's every little bit matters. And like some like Carlos complained this weekend, what is the point of having a rule book if you're not going to follow the rules? Even though that comment was ridiculous. I was like, Carlos, get back to the car. Relax.
We'll get to that later.
But yeah, so Logan partially impeded Lance, and he actually ended up getting a three-place grid penalty for that. So he had qualified P20, ended up P20. But then Alex
If you want to
Albon.
get technical, it was P23.
Yeah. But I remember last season when he got like a 10 place grid penalty and we were like, what is he gonna do? Start P30? Like start way further back. But Alex Albon actually ended up later on when the race started, he actually started from the pit lane, Alex Albon. So then Logan Sargent started P19 actually. So he actually benefited from all of this in the end. But those who got out in Q1 were Kevin Magnussen, Yuki, Danny, Alex, and Logan. Then Q3, we actually, well, so
Q2.
yeah,
Q2.
Q2. I was very excited to see both of the Sauber, Steak, Kick, whatever, get into Q2. I was very excited about that. So we see in Q2, Fernando it was P11, P12 was Bottas, P13 Hulkenberg, P14 Lance Stroll, and P15 Zhou Guanyu. It was interesting because it was like when Zhou got to Q2, his times were just so far behind everybody else. It was so strange. It was like he was fast enough to get to Q2, but then the moment he got to Q2, it was like his tires shit the bed.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's, tire strategy, maybe even internal confidence, but it did. It seemed like because I think this is the second or third time moving out of Q1. And I feel like every single time, and almost similar to, I think the one or two times that Logan Sargent has moved out of Q1, it's almost like they get to it, they have this like, oh, almost like not overexcitement, but this huge amount of excitement for the fact that they're moving on, and then they just cannot get the time. So I don't know if it becomes nerves or whatever, but at the end of the day, he moved beyond Q1.
Yeah, I think I heard Ruth Buscom actually say that they had used the full two or three sets of softs, the Saubers in Q1. So it was almost like they used up all of their tires for Q1 in hopes to get to Q2. And I think that maybe that was their strategy that like it doesn't matter what you get in Q2, as long as you get there, being 11 through 15 is better than 16 through 20. And I do think
Well,
it benefited Joe in the end.
And not to like, I feel like this is like a fangirl on Ruth like episode, but she did make a comment about, sometimes you do have to get to the small victories. So they might have used out all their tires for Q1, but you know what? Their goal wasn't to get to Q3, it was to get to Q2. Like that was just the goal because you know what? At the end of the day, a 14 place grid placement is better than a 15 place grid placement.
Oh,
So,
100%.
yeah.
Yeah. So that was Q2. And then Q3,
Well, did you say who got knocked out?
yeah, I started up
Oh,
with that.
okay.
Q3, Oscar, Oscar. Oh my gosh. Boy was having a tough weekend. I was feeling so bad for him the whole time. So
Did he
Oscar,
did he even get a time? Like he
no.
got one. No, he had no time.
Yeah, so he did his lap and then it was deleted because of track limits at the exit of turn 10. And then he goes to do another push lap and he actually went out before most of the other cars so that he could get a clean lap in. And then I don't know which turn it was on, but he ended up going a little bit too wide on one of the turns and ended up in the gravel. And so then he ended up not being able to finish the lap. And at that point, it was 0 seconds on the clock. So he wasn't going to be able to do another one, which was really upsetting. So he ended up starting P10 with zero time.
Well, he started P9 because Perez got a grid penalty. So
I didn't even
Checo,
realize that. What did he
yeah.
do?
So I don't remember, but Checo moved back to I think P11, and so then Oscar got to move up to P9. So. Um, yeah, I feel like the only thing I had was um Ferrari just is still on the struggle bus. They're doing okay. They're doing okay, guys, but I just feel like there was this like they did really decent in FP3 and again it's practice so you can't really like time it off. But I feel like maybe it's because they were doing so well at the beginning of the season, being on podium, that like anything that's not in the top three, they're disappointed. But it does seem like it was not all happiness, you know?
Do we think that Mercedes are the McLaren of last year and Ferrari are the Aston Martin of last year?
I mean, I think Aston Martin is Aston Martin of last year, if not worse. I
I
mean,
think Aston Martin started off the season not great and they've continued to be not great
yeah, I
for
mean,
them. Like it's not like they're coming dead last, but they're still not performing to, I know, at least Fernando's ability.
yeah, I don't know what's going on with Ferrari. Again, they're not doing terribly. Like they're still in the like they're fighting in the top, like they're in the top three of the 10 teams. But it's just I don't know it, and maybe we're getting to that point where, we're hitting the European leg. People are about to get testy. We need silly season like that summer break is not super close, but we're getting closer to it. I wonder if like we're just kind of feeling that friction. I mean, we're feeling it at a team like Alpine all the time. It seems like Ferrari is a little tense. I mean, Lewis had a great weekend this weekend, but Lewis has not been on the Mercedes fan club like at all. So I wonder if we're kind of seeing the poor execution of strategy just kind of that is causing deeper frustration, which is just kind of causing a weaker performance.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't
But
know.
that's all I have for qualifying. Do you have anything else for qualifying?
Lando took pole, and
Oh
it's
yeah,
only his second career pole. His first was Sochi 2021.
which is a sore
Um,
subject because he almost won that race.
But I thought that that was really exciting. I think if you don't have the time and can only watch a little bit of this weekend, definitely go check out Q3. It was a lot of fun because Max was in the lead and then got the checkered flag. And right as he got the checkered flag, Lando was able to put in a faster lap time. So, very exciting. I think, like everyone has projected, obviously, this is not spoiling it, but Lando did not win this weekend. But I think there will be plenty of opportunity, as we've seen from the McLaren. So
Yeah,
that's all I
I
have for qualifying.
I agree. I think Lando's lap was probably his best lap that he, at least in the year that we've been fans, and from what I can tell from past years, it was probably one of the best laps that he's ever done. It was perfect. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, now let's go into the race. Okay, race time. So, in this race, like I said before, Alex Albon started from the pit lane. When the start happened, George Russell cut in front of Matt. Well, okay, hold on to start off. Lando pulled your classic Max start move by pushing whoever was in P2 to the side into the
Whoever
track.
was in P2, Max Verstappen.
Yes, I know, but I'm saying your classic Max move. That's what Max does
Oh, okay.
every
I thought you
single
were like,
time.
whoever.
No, this is just what Max does every single time. And so Lando pulled the same move on him, which is really funny because Max was like, he drove me into the dirt. How does it feel, bro? You do this every weekend to everybody. That's the reason why Charles always loses because of you in those moments. And actually, because Lando did that with Max, George had a second to like slide around them and actually ended up taking the lead. But then by the time that lap two came around, Max just blew past George.
Yeah, I definitely think, I mean, we've seen it happen before where the max kind of shove, that's what we'll call it, the max shove, gets really kind of, I feel like it gives either third or fourth, sometimes even fifth place, the opportunity to kind of sweep in. And I think it was perfectly executed. Obviously, the Mercedes didn't have the pace of the Red Bull and the McLaren, and I think that was really the result. Um, but, it's funny. I don't know if it would be, I'm not a driver, so I don't know what the best start strategy is. I just think it's interesting that, it kind of opens that door like we saw. But it adds an interesting level of spice to the start that doesn't involve carnage.
Well, yeah, it was a fully clean start and actually about Lando pushing Max kind of into the grass, but still gave him room on the track. In the post-race press conference, Lando was asked about it. Lando was like, I gave him enough room. I mean, at least I believe I did. It's not like I could take a tape measure and measure it. So to me, it was enough room. And Max's response was, I know what your next birthday gift is going to be, some glasses or a really large mirror. And I'm waiting for someone to turn back at him and be like, bro, have you ever watched your starts over again? Because this is the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, they all complain about each other in the same way and all do the same things. So, I mean, like the way they reacted to Montreal, because Montreal was similar to Miami, they're they love it. They love to complain, they live to complain.
Literally in my notes, I wrote, as I'm watching the race, one of my notes was Max complaining about start.
So Lewis behind a little bit further behind. Lewis did lose one spot to Charles off the start, but unfortunately, like I just said, the Ferraris did not really have, the pace or the strategy, in my humble opinion. So Lewis was able to move past him and regain fourth position pretty quickly. And like Emma said, by the third lap, Max was already passed and in the lead. The two Ferraris got a little spicy towards the front with Carlos trying to pass but not really being that successful. I feel like we kind of saw this like little bit of desperation from Carlos, and I feel like desperation's kind of mean, but I feel like there was this similar to I almost feel like that desperation that we saw with Checo in Mexico where and like then he crashed. I feel like they get like this almost like this amounting amount of pressure on them with wanting to result well, have a magical fairy tale weekend like Charles is in Monaco. And so I feel like we kind of saw Carlos. Also, I feel like the Carlos relationship is rubbing. It's getting a little tenser. I don't know
It's
if it's his own personal qualms with, having to make a lot of really life-changing decisions. But I definitely think that the Ferraris, we've seen communication issues in the past between what the plan is, but I do feel like it's not the last time we'll see this.
No, I think we're gonna have a very rough rest of the season between Carlos and Charles, to be honest. I think Carlos is frustrated with the situation. Um, yeah. Yeah, that's all I'm gonna say. Um, my next note was that well, also just to mention, everybody started on soft tires except for one person who had started on mediums, who I think was Alex
Alex
Albon.
Albon.
Which I found to be quite interesting that everybody was starting on softs. I don't think we had people start on softs in a long time. Like I feel like most of the time we see mediums, but not softs. So that was an interesting one. And I think people started to pit around between lap 10 and lap like 16. Unless you were, who was it? Oscar, Lando, and Charles. Everybody else pitted between laps 10 and 16. And then Oscar didn't pit until lap 22, Lando 24, and Charles was like 25. Which I did not know that soft tires could last that long, to be honest. But the entire mom and dad were sitting with me watching it, and dad was like, "Can they go for that long?" And I was like, this is a first, I think. That it definitely is gonna get really tough for them to continue driving on them."
I mean, temperature, it was fairly warm, but I'm not, this is a very amateur podcast, people, so we're just sharing our thoughts. But there was quite a bit of support racing going on, so I'm sure that there was a bit more track buildup, which increases the rubber on the track, so I'm not sure if that had a play too. The tire dog maybe not might not have been as aggressive. Um, I also wonder if just like the layout and the type of track it is probably less rough on the tires. Uh, so yeah, but I was shocked by the fact that there was such a large range of that first pit. I feel like we normally have within like, 5 to 7 laps of people, but this was like in the teens, between the first person and the last person. It was quite a handful.
Well, because of the temperature and the way the race was going, it was questionable on whether it was going to be a two-stop or a three-stop race.
Yeah.
And it ended up being mostly a two-stop race. I think those who ended up doing a three-stop were at the bottom of the results. But those who ended up doing a two-stop I think well, most of them were closer to the top, and it really depended on what tires you were using. Like at some point, George would put onto hards, and it was very obvious that those were not working well. I mean, he got fast his lap with them when he was on them, but then he was like, "I'm sliding around out here. I need them off."
hmm
And then Lewis had gone into pit, and they knew immediately not to put him on hards, and they actually put him onto softs, which was interesting. It was like, let's just go the opposite direction and see which works. Obviously, the softs ended up working with the race results. But yeah, back to the race. When Pierre Gasly had a pit stop, it was a
6.7 second pit stop, you mean? Friggin' gray hair pit stop. Like,
that was my note. I was finishing saying that. I was about to say it
yeah,
was a 6.7 second pit stop. So you
I
beat
have
me
it
to it.
bolded. Yeah, I have it bolded. It was just like, because honestly, it was Pierre's 6.7, and then he went in, and then Max went in and got a 1.9 second pit stop. And obviously, two very different teams.
Well, Max not only got a 1.9 second pit stop, but George also had a bad pit stop. He had like a 5.6 second pit stop, and it was during a crucial moment, actually. So lap 16, both George and Carlos go into the pit lane to get new tires, and George, I believe, was in first, and Carlos was in second, and Carlos got out first, and George got out second, or it was vice versa. But anyways, George got a 5.6 second pit stop, which severely screwed him. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought
Um,
things were gonna get spicy in the pit lane. I'm like, are we about to race right now? Is someone about to crash?
I don't think I was paying enough attention to what was happening in the pit lane because there was a decent amount of movement happening on the track. But yeah.
At this point, we also find out that Kevin Magnussen got a 5-second penalty for a false start. Um, he's getting very close to the what is it, 12 penalty points that you can get. So I'm quite nervous for him. I'm really hoping that he's fine. And even Alex Jakes was like, I didn't really notice the false start, but apparently they did. So I guess it's
Yeah,
a
but
penalty.
remember we talked about it, I think last race episode, the FIA chooses their one thing. And last year it was track limits. I mean, there was one race that it was like they were track limiting people up the wazoo. And this year it's false starts. I mean, I feel like I've heard more about false start penalties. I mean, we haven't been watching for that long, so maybe I'm wrong, but it's their one thing this season. They're inconsistent on everything but false starts, you know? They choose one weird penalty to focus on. And not weird, like I get the importance of them and track limits, but you know what I mean. There's like other things we should be focusing on. But I digress.
I agree. Lap 19, we see Lewis pass Carlos at turn one, and it was a little bit of a dicey fight right there. I almost felt like it was personal there for a second, like Carlos being like, "You took my seat, my potential spot for the next year." But eventually, Lewis passed him, and it was clean, and it was all good. So,
I think that that is a hard thing to decide since we don't know them personally and don't have conversations with them. But I do think that again, it was kind of that similar reaction that we've been having where I don't want to say freak out on the radio, but they kind of complain. And then post race, I believe Hamilton commented on it and he was like, it was just clean, tight racing. And I think that's the problem is that where it's a knife's edge, you're constantly walking on what is clean, tight racing that has people on the edge of their seats and what is a safety concern. And I feel like, unfortunately, not to generalize, because they have grown up and they've seen some horrific things, and they've seen the horrors of this sport. I sometimes do feel like the younger guys are quick to be like, give me that spot back, whereas the older guys are like, come and get it. Like, freaking fight for it.
so I think Lewis passing Carlos today was the perfect example of not getting penalized for clean, tight racing, and then I think K-Mag has been penalized
Yeah,
rightfully so sometimes, but I also think that it's been clean, tight racing and he's just been penalized for it because the
yeah.
FIA has decided that it's unsafe, but some of it not like actually was just normal racing. Which almost I think we talked about it in an episode a couple episodes ago where it feels like it discourages intense, good racing.
Well, it is. I think it is very easy for us to have this conversation because we're not in the seat. We've not been on this adrenaline rush of danger. But I do think the sport is changing and it's ever changing. I mean, compared to what, drivers were doing 10, 15, even 40 years ago, it's very different. But again, it's when do the complaints become the just complaints? When is it? I don't want to say the boy who cried wolf because it's not at all. We've all seen it, but again, when does it become like, okay, you're like no one cares?
Yeah, I agree. Okay. So like I said, Lando, Oscar, and Charles all pit between lap 22 and 25. And then when around lap 26-ish, we see Lando pass Carlos catching up because he comes out behind a couple people that he was ahead of before. And Lando and Oscar were really trying to extend that first stint, which I think benefited Lando and I think hurt Oscar. I think if Oscar had gone in at the same time as most others, then he would have done better.
I think it's something that McLaren has really been trying to push their limits on, and I think it's something we've seen them do more than other teams, is they are trying to, in my opinion, and I feel like I've been saying that at the beginning of every sentence, but I feel like they have been trying to see the level of extension. They've been trying to work with the already used tire. Like, okay, is it worth it to stay on the used tire, or is it worth it to come in, put on a new tire, and then have to warm up said new tire? I feel like out of all the teams, the last two, three races, McLaren has consistently pushed the envelope on their tire age. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they're trying to push it, like specifically with Lando, trying to get him to have the biggest gap possible in the front because he's got clean air. And I think it was Alex Jakes pointed out, I think the McLaren has that is the fastest car when it has no dirty air. At the moment it has dirty air, I think it's a very hard time passing other
Hmm.
cars. And I think when they do have the clean air of no car in front of them, they're like, Lando, go. And I think they're hoping that he can build as much of a gap as possible. And there was a minute, there was not a minute, there was like a lap or two there where he had an 18-second gap between him and I think it was Max. And I think that would have been the perfect moment for him to go and pit because then he goes in, gets the tires, he comes out immediately behind Max, and he wouldn't have that hard of a time having to catch up. Where they ended up pushing it, and he was like 13 seconds ahead of Max. And I think that that was cutting it a bit too close. And
Well,
I
and I think
actually think that pushing it that long is what lost him the race, to be honest.
Well, and I think it's kind of been that little bit of strategy that they're pushing that's kind of bit them in the ass because Montreal is very debated. I believe from what I've seen online, McLaren fully believes the extra lap or two that they did, they're like, it was perfect. We should have stayed out, which I kind of agree with them. I think that they should have stayed out. Their timing was improving. But I think whereas this weekend, their time wasn't improving. They were losing time fast. But again, from a strategy point of view, it is such a tight decision that it's like only within one lap did he lose all that time. You know,
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
envy them their job.
they have to try these things out to see if it's actually going to work or not. So I think this showed them what conditions they can push those tires to, and we'll see what they do the rest of the time.
Yeah.
But I think they've been pushing Lando like this, and I think that they've been having Oscar join in on that strategy. I don't know if they need to be doing the same strategy for both cars all the time because I think
Yeah.
that that is ruining Oscar's race a lot of the time. So yeah. Lap 32, we see Lando pass Lewis. And Oscar had been passing Checo and Esteban at this time. Lap 35, we see Lando pass George, and
Hmm.
George almost immediately afterwards pit for hards. But that battle right there between Lando and George was actually really good because it was like a back and forth a bunch, going around a couple of turns, and then I was like on the edge of my seat thinking that they were gonna crash, but they ended up being okay. But yeah, George ended up going in for hards and around lap 37, and then around lap 43, Lewis went in for softs because between those 6 laps, we had discovered that the hards were a no-go for Mercedes.
Yeah.
At lap 45, we see Max go in and pit, and I believe he put softs on. And then Lando pit at lap 48 for softs, and he actually came out second behind Max,
It
which was a good pit strategy, I think.
I agree, but it was quite a long pit stop. It was a 3.6-second pit stop, so that was on the longer front. I think from the pundit's perspective and a strategy perspective, it put the car on the edge. If that had been a second faster, who knows?
If
It
that
shoulda,
had
coulda,
been
woulda.
if that had been their world record,
1.8.
1.8-second pit stop,
Hmm.
we would have had a fight at the very end.
I mean, 3.6 is not great, but it's not 5. So we'll take it.
Yeah, I guess. And then we see right after that we find out that Nico Hulkenberg got a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. The Haas's were just taking all the hits this weekend. We also see Yuki get a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. Um, I was about to call them Alpatari. The V carbs, they just couldn't do it this weekend. Neither could the Williams. It was just a horrible weekend for both of those teams. But a lot of the pundits were saying V-Carb might be taking one step back to take two steps forward. I do hope for their sake that that is what happens, but we shall see. Um, okay. Lap 52, we see Lewis pass George.
Oh,
So you go.
before you get into at lap 51, just for some perspective, the gap between Max and Lando is 6.6 seconds. So that's what the gap is at lap 51. So 6.6 seconds. Remember that number. Emma, you
Well,
get into lap 52.
just to continue on that, actually, the comment that you made, Max, even though it was a 6 second gap, he was not calm. There was a radio between him and GP where GP was like, go into setting 10 or something. And Max is like, what? And GP's like, 10. And Max is like, I can't hear you. And he's like panicking. And I was like, this is one of the first times I've heard Max truly panic. And then GP has to go 1-0, Max. And I was like, damn.
I think I mean it's at the end of the day he's having to work for it significantly harder, you know? And so I think that there's this uncomfortable. I mean, think about this time last year. He talked about, bringing pillows into the cars and taking naps, like, or he would get to the finish line and it would be 15 to 20 seconds. And so I think it's pushing Red Bull's, strategy and like just communication to the limit, which I think is good for any team. It's making it interesting, but you're definitely seeing a sense of no, I don't even know panic's correct. I think it's almost like physical exertion. Like he just seems exhausted at the end of everything. Um, which I mean is great for the competition, but when you're not coasting and able to zigzag to the finish line, I think you're gonna get a little more tense.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so lap 52, we see Lewis pass George, which typically, so Barcelona is the track that Lewis and Nico Rosberg back in, I believe it was the 2016 season, had their big crash, and it was a whole big thing. This is where all the Mercedes stuff kind of stems from. So, whenever people see two Mercedes fighting at Barcelona specifically, I think that people get a little nervous. And I think even the pundits made kind of digs at it throughout the weekend. They were like, Lewis Hamilton doesn't always have the happiest of memories around that turn. And I'm like, oh gosh, why do you need to mention that? But yeah, Lewis passed George at lap 52, and it didn't seem like the happiest of passes. I think George was quite frustrated, but Lewis had better tires than him, so it is what it is. Lap 58, we see Danny actually pass Kevin Magnussen for 16th, which, yes, it doesn't matter for points, but still kind of a important thing for all of those cars. And then towards the very end, we see Alex Albon actually in the gravel. He didn't lose any
Yep.
positions, but he had like a 10-second gap between him and the car behind him. But he just made it a smaller gap, which is fine. But it made no sense. And immediately afterwards, there was the strangest radio between him and the team.
It was quite uncomfortable. I don't know if it was a tire issue or a car issue. It wasn't really like clear or really explained, but essentially Alex kind of had an emotional response, kind of like check in on that. His team was like all good on our front, and he's like, it just happened 5 seconds ago. Like there can't be any way it's all good on your front. Um, so again, it was towards the end of the race. I don't know if this is just kind of the end of race vibes where people are, it's been an hour and a half, they're freaking done. They're tense. That's what I'm thinking. I think about the amount of times we would yell at people at the end of race pieces on the freaking erg. Um, but I do think there was a concern about the car or Alex himself and his team was like, "Oh, we're all good." And he was like, "No, you're not. Like, check again."
Yeah, so in the post-race show, they actually talked about it, and Alex actually talked about it. He was like, I know the limits of this car, and I wasn't putting the car. on beyond those limits. And for me to go into the gravel when I'm not even putting it beyond those limits was strange. And he was like, I wasn't sure if it was a gust of wind or if it was a car problem. I think that they had determined it was a gust of wind, a very strong gust of wind, that ended
Well,
up
and
putting him into the gravel. So,
that there were strong gusts. That's something we haven't talked about, but there was a there was a high possibility of rain, which then, as of this morning, dropped down to a 20% chance of rain. But they were saying that it was quite gusty at the circuit. So, and again, it's a car made out of carbon fiber, guys. It's like a good gust of wind, that thing is gonna take off.
yeah. So that was the uncomfortable radio message between Alex and his team. That was the only thing that I really had towards the end because I feel like the last 6 laps, all we were watching was Lando catching up to Max and hoping that he might get within those last 2 seconds. But Max ended up winning by it was like 2.2 seconds or something like that. And the what Lando blames himself for the start. That's one thing I know for sure.
That seemed to be the biggest takeaway. So, like I told you guys to remember that number. At lap 51, the gap between Lando and Max was 6.6 seconds. Towards the end of the race, by lap 65, the gap was 2.3 seconds. So, that in and of itself is just a feat for McLaren. The fact that they were able to sit there and shave off, over 4 seconds, 4.3 seconds of time towards a Red Bull is something honestly unfathomable in the last 12 to 18 months in terms of this sport. Um, I think we're kind of at that point where I don't want to say we've seen this before with Lando and Max, but I do feel
But we
like
have
we've
though.
seen this before where it has been this build up, this build up, this build up, and then it's like if he had 2 more laps, if he had 3 more laps, like, and so I don't know if that's just, we're gonna get to a point where the tide turns and, Max is in Lando's position and Lando's in the front. But yeah, I think just understanding how much time and you could tell, yes, there was the tense radio message between GP and Max where he was like, did you say 10 or 2? But also, you could see that, Red Bull was really trying to reassure, like, hey, Max, Lando's burning through his tires. Like, we just need you to push. Like, there was a little bit of like,
I thought that
keep
was so
pushing. We
funny.
might not. Yeah, it almost felt like, don't worry, like, he's gonna shit the bed. Like, we got this. And it was like, no, like, he's still walking. Like, he's still coming.
Yeah, so it was definitely a feat for Lando to be catching up to Max, especially because Max had put those soft tires on lap 45 and Lando got them on lap 48. So it's not like there was a significant age difference of the tires. And they both had the same compound. They were both on softs. So for him to be catching up that significantly on basically similar tires and same compound just shows that the McLaren is the faster car out of the two, to be honest. It does have more speed, but then it really, I think it's going to come down to strategy from now on because I think Lando knows how to drive a good race now. And it seems like after his first win, he's just hungry for more. And I do think that there were some strategy calls that kind of screwed him this race. But at the same time, you're never going to get your strategy perfect unless it's by chance. You just have to have a really good day sometimes. And I think Red Bull had the perfect day with their strategy. I think McLaren did not. I think that they'll probably learn from this, I would imagine, and they'll learn when they should pit, when they shouldn't pit. But also, we're taking this as fans. I'm not sitting there reading the data. I'm just basing it off of when I saw the time going down before that first stint. So
So, with that final, with Max winning, Lando was able to secure the fastest lap. So, he was able to do fastest lap in a minute, 17.115 seconds. On top of it, this moved him into second place in the driver's standings. So now Lando is in second place with 150 points, and he passed Charles Leclerc, who is at 148 points. So I think the gap to Max is like 75 or 100 points. I don't know. I'm tired of making can drivers championship predictions, to be honest, because I feel like we
Okay,
say the same shit every freaking week.
so in
But
order for Lando to win the Drivers' Championship, Max needs to DNF the next three races, and Lando has to win the next three races,
yeah,
and then we're all good to go.
and mom needs to learn how to fly. Like that is just absolutely ridiculous. Like what are you gonna do? Poison the guy? Like I just maybe we'll see what happens. I definitely I'm intrigued. I think, like I've said, the biggest fight I think is going to be McLaren and Ferrari. I think we thought it
I
was going to be
agree.
Ferrari and Red Bull, but I do think Mercedes. I don't know. I don't know. I'm t like I said, I just said 5 seconds ago. I'm so tired of making predictions because every weekend someone improves and someone gets worse, and it's so flip-floppy right now.
Yeah, I agree. All right, final thoughts?
Final thoughts.
So, one of the things that I wanted to make sure to mention was that both Alpines were in the points this weekend, which was super exciting for them. I don't know what they've been doing to their car to actually get there, because they were with Williams in the back of the pack at the very beginning, and now they are both in the points. I truly am at a loss because I don't understand, but it's great for them. Bad for Williams, but great for them.
Yeah, I think it's great for them. I think it's a better projection than what they thought. I think, unfortunately, now Williams is kind of really falling behind majorly. Um, I don't know what Alpine's doing because it's not really ever clear because there's like no one working at Alpine to make it clear. But yeah, it seems like everyone seems confident on that front, the few people that they've spoken to, but yeah. One thing we forgot to mention that I just wanted to mention, and unfortunately I'm sorry guys, life has been really busy. F1 Academy was this weekend. I wasn't personally able to watch it, but I will probably review that this week just to, keep up on it. But as per usual, love to support it, love to see it. Yeah, I don't really know much about it.
I do know that Chloe Chambers brought Haas their very first win. Let's go.
Yeah, love to see it. Now just F1 now needs to make that win happen.
That would be nice, but I mean, this is associated with F1, so it's kind of a win. So
Oh, it
it's very
is.
good.
Yeah.
Um, and Dorian Penn was back for this, even though she did have a broken wrist, I think it was, or there was some injury or whatever that she was out for. But she's back now. Um, I think the Alpine thing was the main thing I wanted to talk about. Oh, Oscar, he did start P9, P10, ended up being P7. Like I said before, I think his race strategy needs to be a bit more unique to him and not just following Lando. I do worry that they are I mean, we already knew that Lando is the number one driver at McLaren, even though I would say Lando and Oscar's ability at the very beginning of the season was pretty equal. But I think Lando has definitely like shown that he has matured a bit this season, that Oscar just needs a bit more experience to get there. But I still don't like how it feels like Oscar is being left behind.
I think you have a second season driver who has had huge, huge amounts of success. I mean, look at who he came in with. You know, him and Logan Sargent have very similar like careers in terms of timeline. Um, I think that we have to remember that this is only his second season. I think he's had a really good performance. Yes, is there a concern that, the first driver, second driver situation? I think if you talk to anyone at McLaren, they'll always say that I think all teams will try to argue that we don't have that set up. But I don't know. I think the results have been there. Do I want more for Oscar? Of course I do. He's one of my favorite drivers on the grid. I think that he has the potential, but I do think he is only in his second season. I see Oscar on the grid for years to come if this is what he continues to do. I think in terms of skill and also the way he talks about the sport, I think he kind of goes hand in hand with Alex Albon and even Max Verstappen, where there's this like cool, calm, like let me look at, even Lewis Hamilton. They have a similar elocution towards the sport that I don't think that you don't really see up front from a lot of the guys. And so, yeah, I'm a little frustrated with his performance, especially since the cars I believe are the same. But, you know, it's early days.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I'll stay calm for now. The last thing I wanted to mention was that Zhou Guanyu ended up P13, which starting from P15, ending P13 in a Sauber right now is definitely a feat. So they're getting a little bit closer to the points. Hopefully they're able to get there soon. I do know that Barcelona is a good track for them typically. I think 2 years ago, this is where Zhou got his first points in F1. I think he qualified in like the top 10 as well or something like that. So I don't know if it's track specific, but this track does give you an example of kind of where you'll sit the rest of the season, which for Williams, I'm very sad about. My last thing on Williams, I know this year they were trying a whole new car strategy, thinking that this was going to be really good at a lot of different tracks. You've been really bad at every track. Please go back to last year. Your car was slippery. You were great in the straights, and you were able to consistently come one of your cars in the top 10. Whatever you changed from last year, change it back. Change it back, please.
You know that meme of Tyra Banks from America's Next Top Model where she's like, "We were all rooting for you. Like, we all rooted for you."
Yes.
I literally quoted that watching it because Chris was talking about Logan Sargent, and I was like, I mean, you can go back and listen to the audio where I'm like, I'll ride or die for Logan, but I've even said, like, I think I'm at this point with Williams where I'm like, you got to try something new. And it's the car. I know it's not all just Logan, but it's like we were rooting for you. Like, I'm at this point where I feel like a Jets fan. Like, I genuinely just feel like a Mets fan, a Jets fan for New Yorkers. You'll get that.
It's definitely not just Logan though, because Alex literally came
Oh yeah.
P18. So it's obviously the car now. And I hate to hate on the car because so many people have put so much work into it, but there's just something that's not working. And last year, y'all had something that was working, at least in
They
some
are.
tracks.
They have discussed they're bringing, new names into their wheelhouse, so we'll see. But it's tough. It's rough being a Williams fan right now, so
It's a
pray for
hard
us.
day every day as a Williams fan, but
Yeah.
we will come back one day,
Yeah,
hopefully,
we
in
will.
our lifetime.
Oh my God, that's so dramatic. I don't really
Well,
have anything else, do you?
no, I do not. So our next race is in Austria. It is at the Red Bull Ring. We are actually about to record the Get Ready episode. Oh my God, Get Ready episode for that immediately after this. So if you see us in the same clothing, if you watch us visually, please do not be concerned that we are wearing the same clothing multiple days in a row because we're not. It's just several hours apart.
So
Not
even
even.
if we were, don't judge. Like
Yeah.
it's 2024. If I want to wear the same shirt 2 days in a row, let me live my life.
All right. Well, that's all for today. Please make sure to go on to our social medias, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and follow us there. And please make sure to stream us on both all of our streaming services and on YouTube. The more views we get on everything, the more it helps us. Please review us, leave comments, thumbs up if you can. Definitely helps us grow a bit further. So that is all. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.